Alright, so today is part 2 of our mini-series on the prep for the London Marathon. Specifically today we're going to be talking about nutrition. So if you are watching this as part of our London 2025 Marathon series, you are entering race week, which is the last week of your taper. There are a lot of things in this week that you can get right, a lot of things that you can potentially get a little bit wrong, specifically around nutrition. So fueling your body correctly for the race could be the difference between you finishing strong or potentially hitting that graded wall. There are different factors that can cause you to kind of hit the wall, but nutrition and fueling for the race is a big one. We tend to see that people start panicking a little bit in this last week. There's obviously the stress starting to raise. We talked about the tools that you have at your disposal to kind of reduce stress levels a little bit in our last video, but one thing that people are not sure about is often nutrition during the last week before the race and fueling nutrition during the race itself. Let's cover that today. We're going to touch on those topics and the differences between male and female athletes in terms of nutrition and what you should look for in terms of carb loading for the marathon. Obviously, when we think about carb loading, we think about eating bucket loads of pasta.
Rigatoni, fettuccine, ravioli, pasta.
But there's a little bit more to it. Your body uses something called glycogen as your high performance fuel. It's the type of energy you can have access to quickly when needed. And essentially, the more you store glycogen, the more you can delay fatigue. Now, to increase glycogen, your body uses carbs. Carbohydrates become glycogen and your body uses that as fuel. So you increase your intake of carbs so that your body can fill up its glycogen stores in view of the race, so that you can push your fatigue threshold as far away as possible. Now see it a little bit like your phone battery. It takes a bit of time to fully charge up your glycogen battery. This is what we're doing over a few days, 2-3 days generally, and essentially carb loading then can be defined as a strategic increase of carbohydrates intake to fill up glycogen stores. But we usually recommend 2 to 3 days before the race. So if your race is on Sunday, I would start carb loading around Thursday. But you might have seen that there's different ways to carb load. Some programs will have you do more exercise. Some programs will have you carb load over more days. Some programs will have you deplete carb levels before loading them again. We tend to not do that just purely because we feel that you're already in quite a stressful period in that last week before the race, and adding more stress by removing carbs before loading again, I feel is just not ideal. But overall, you'll see that most programs will have the same guidelines in the sense that it's a short-term increase of carbs intake for a short-term decrease of exercise. In this case, running mileage dropping, like we said in our previous video, to 50% of what it was on peak week. We usually aim between 8 to 12 carbs per day per kilogram of body weight. How much specifically will depend on how well you deal with the carb loading process, whether you've done it before. Because we like run numbers, we could say 10 grams per kilogram of body weight. So a 50 kg runner will need 500 grams of carbs extra per day. As I said, you will need to see how you feel. You're already exercising a lot less than you were doing the previous weekend, the week before that. So, in terms of carb utilization and your glycogen, it doesn't get used as much. So you're already to some extent carb loading in that sense. So, within that range, 8 to 12, you kind of have to try and error as well. Doing too much too quickly can make you feel a little bit lethargic. And obviously increasing carbs increases blood glucose as well, and the dreaded crashes that come with that. You may say as well that it might just impact a little bit on your sleep, might impact on the way you digest as well. So yeah, there's a bit of trial and error to do initially. First of all, remember glycogen stores utilize water. So you need to increase your water intake. You need to increase hydration. So definitely go through 2 to 3 liters a day, and more if you feel that you need a little bit more. You need to have a carb loading window. Usually recommended between 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. Just purely for the fact that you should have at least a good 2-3 hours to allow yourself to digest the carbs that you're eating before you go to sleep. Otherwise it will impact your sleep and by extension your recovery before the race. So yeah, just make sure that you stick to that window as much as possible, and obviously still reduce everything else that is toxic to your recovery, such as alcohol, lack of sleep, etc. Now, carb loading usually in most programs is done by itself, but it's important to recognize the fact that you need also an increase of sodium. You want your carb battery to be full for the race, but you also want your sodium battery to be full for the race. Lack of sodium, often during the race because we sweat it out or because we drink excessive amounts of water that dilute the level of sodium in our blood, can have dangerous consequences, including something that we call water intoxication, which impacts your organs, way of working during the race, specifically your brain. Female runners of low BMI who are running their first marathon are specifically at risk. So sodium intake is also key during the carb loading phase and also during the race, where we'll talk about a little bit more. And you can increase up to 2, sometimes 3 grams of sodium per day during the carb loading phase as well. Pretzels, your pickle juice, your extra sprinkle of sea salt, sports drinks like Gatorade, Powerade, etc. will have an increase in sodium concentration as well. So it's good to kind of keep that in mind during the carb loading window, and we'll talk about it in a second during your race fueling as well. Male and female may have to carb load slightly differently. It's mainly due to a hormone that people who have periods have called estradiol. Deals with menstruation essentially. This hormone specifically affects the way you use carbs versus fats during your workout, specifically lower intensity workouts sustained for long periods of time, which means that women burn more fat during those activities, specifically when that hormone is at higher concentrations. The generic advice, which is to increase your carb ratio within your current sort of calorie intake. So instead of having, your third on the plate, protein, carbs and veggies, you are usually advised to replace that by half of that being carbs, a quarter veggies and a quarter protein. Now in female, if you do that, so if you don't change your overall calorie intake, but just replace your carb ratio, research has shown that it has no positive impact on your performance. And that's because of the effect of estradiol onto the way you use carbs versus fats. Instead, females should add the extra carbs on top of their current calorie intake to get the same positive effect on their performance. For female runners, it may mean that you feel super full all the time because you'll need to kind of add the extra carbs on top of what you're already eating. So for example, a 55 kg runner needs to increase their carb intake by 550 grams per day. That needs to be added on to what they were eating before, which means that you get about 2200 calories per day on carbs alone, on top of what you were already eating. But that's the right way of carb loading for a female runner. Okay, so I'm going to try and put this on a graph. Let's put the marathon on this graph. So where at the bottom of the graph is the duration of the activity. So we have the start line and then the finish line on the other line. Now as primary sources of energy, we have 2 main batteries. We need both of them to run a marathon. You've got the fat battery, which is in green here, and then the carb battery, which is in orange here. See them a little bit like the batteries in your remote controller for your TV. You need 2 of them for the controller to work. If one is empty, then the controller doesn't work. The fat battery is always full. Let's say that you can't really deplete it. Carbs battery is a lot smaller and is a lot quicker to deplete itself. Usually it takes about 90 to 120 minutes to go empty. With the carb battery here, you can see if I'm carb fueling properly for the race, it'll be full. That's important to know because essentially you'll need both of those energies to kind of run the marathon, but obviously you need them to be available all the way through the activity. So it's important to carb load, so you start with a full carbs battery, but as opposed to the fat battery that doesn't really run out, the carb battery in 90 to 120 minutes will be empty, and this is you hitting the wall. But if I keep adding carbs into the carb battery, then I should be able to carry on all the way through to the finish line without hitting the wall. Complete carb loading strategy includes obviously the few days before the race, but also includes fueling within the race. If you go back to the diagram that we had initially, remember the two batteries, the fat battery, the carb battery. The fat battery, it was quite impossible to deplete it through the race, but the carb battery is actually a lot smaller. And yes, we want to be able to come up to the race with a full carb battery, but because it's smaller and because you'll burn through carbs a lot more quickly than you do through fat, during the race it can deplete itself quite quickly, and often around 90 to 120 minutes is what it takes to get rid of all your carb reserve during the race, and then that's usually when you hit the wall. So we want to avoid that, and to do this we need to top up our carb level during the race so that you'll maintain an acceptable level of carbs that you can use to fuel your muscles throughout the race. On the morning of the race, so this is 2 to 3 hours before the race, I usually recommend to eat between 1 to 4 grams of carbs per kilograms of body weight. This is your white toast, this is your jam, banana, peanut butter type of breakfast. Keep it low in fibers, definitely on the day of the race. You can have a little bit of protein. The goal of the breakfast is to increase carb one last time before the race. If you're used to them, you can actually take a gel 15 to 20 minutes before the race. Now, during the race, the recommendation is usually to eat between 30 to 60 grams of carbs per hour. Experienced marathon runners may go up to 90 grams, depending on obviously the performance they need to push out of their body. This is where your gels, your drink mix can come in. At the clinic, we keep it simple. We recommend Morton 160. It's 160 calories for 40 grams of carbs. So if you take one every 45 minutes, it can be a little bit quicker, 40, 35, then you should be able to keep your carb level high enough throughout the race that you don't hit the wall. What's important is that you don't wait until you feel like you need it. You have to be proactive with taking gels, hence why we recommend keeping to a structure in cycles of 35 to 45 minutes. Remember sodium. It's important to also keep an eye on sodium during the race. Now, luckily enough, sports drink often recommended to carry on yourself or often handed out during drink stations will have increased levels of sodium. The risk is that you consume too much water too quickly in one go, enough to dilute your level of sodium within blood and impact your organ function. So that's important that you keep an eye on that. Don't chuck water during the race. You have to kind of take regular little sips of water to avoid that risk of potentially having too much water for your organs to deal with. I hope this was useful. Remember, a carb loading strategy has to be a personal thing. It has to be tailored to you to make sure that the levels of carbs or food intake, of calorie intake, don't affect you negatively. And then obviously in terms of fueling for the race, there's always that little bit of fine-tuning that needs to happen as well. So if this is your first marathon, be cautious, try things out over a day, increase the next day before kind of going head first into it. But there are key guidelines and key differences we've seen between male and female runners to know. You can keep this video in mind in the last few days going to your race. You've trained, you managed to go through your training block here. This is race week. Try to take the stress away from it by nailing your nutrition, nailing your fueling during the race. Essentially, you've trained smart, and you have to eat smart as well, and this can make all the difference between you finishing strong or potentially hitting that dreaded wall. Again, any issues, any questions, feel free to reach out, leave a comment. If you're in London, come and visit us. We'll be more than happy to help you out or book you in with our sport nutritionist for a full kind of carb loading strategy review.